Hello everyone and welcome to the National Army Museum for this week's Friday Insight. The museum is the national home of the history and heritage of the Army, a place where you can experience the story of the Army from the perspective of those who have served in it. There are many ways to support the museum. You can buy a book in our shop, visit the cafe, donate or become a member where you can get exclusive discounts and your very own events programme. Today, I'm delighted to welcome Dr. Grace Huxford. Grace is Associate Professor in Modern History at the University of Bristol, where she specialises in the social history of modern Britain. She is the author of The Korean War in Britain and numerous articles on Cold War history. She is currently writing an oral history of British military communities in Germany during the Cold War. Today, she will present the fascinating social history of British military bases in Germany during the Cold War. So there will be time for questions at the end of the discussion for both our online and in-person audiences. For our online audiences, you can post questions in the chat bar and these will be put to our speaker at the end of the talk. Moving on with some technical points, should we encounter any technical issues, please bear with us while we work to rectify them. If your stream freezes, we suggest that you click the refresh button at the top of your browser. A member of our team will be active in the chat bar to assist you should you have any issues or queries. With that being said, I'm now going to hand over to Grace. I hope you all enjoyed today's talk. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much to the National Army Museum for hosting me again, and for you all, and to you all for coming to this talk, both in person and online. It's really great to talk to you about my current research and my forthcoming book, Cold War Frontier, which is a social history and an oral history of British military bases and communities in Germany between 1945 and roughly 2000. So for over 50 years, Germany was Britain's truest Cold War frontline. First stationed there as a post-war occupying force, the British Army of the Rhine, together with RAF Germany, became a central part of NATO forces in Western Europe, lined up to face the Soviet Union and Warsaw Pact countries, and equipped from the early 1950s with tactical nuclear weaponry. During the Cold War, British bases in Germany were home to hundreds of thousands of military personnel, their families, and a whole range of organisations and British and German civilian employees. An entire generation of service personnel passed in and out of these bases, scattered across North Rhine-Westphalia, Lower Saxony, and Berlin. And for British people, Germany was the scene of some of the most dramatic episodes of Cold War history, from the Berlin blockade and airlift to famously the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989. However, I would argue that this history plays a really significant role in Britain's Cold War history too. Henry Stanhope wrote in the Times in 1984 that its initials BAOR are among the most familiar in post-war Britain. British politicians used bases as a stage to project particular visions of British international power, security, Allied military cooperation, and European community. And the photograph of Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher, clad in headscarf and goggles on a tank in Lüneburg Heath in 1986, remains one of the most sort of iconic political images of the late 20th century. I don't have a picture of it here, but many of you will know the photo I'm referring to. But British bases also became targets for anti-nuclear protesters, European terrorist groups, and the Provisional IRA from the 1970s. But outside of these quite dramatic episodes, and I would argue beyond Berlin, Germany was an ever-present element in Britain's military thinking and a crucial part in many military and service careers. But the British presence in Germany was frequently taken for granted. It continually hovered in the background, mentioned in passing, often in newspapers, television, family conversation, and its purpose never always fully understood. As historian Alwyn Turner, who was born in a British military hospital in Germany in the late 1960s, summarised when we spoke to him, it was a state of being. By the time I was properly conscious of it, the army had been there for 30 years. It didn't even enter into any consciousness that this would come to an end sometime. The idea that Britain had bases in Germany, well, of course we did, always had. And historians of modern Britain, too, have also been largely just accepted the British presence in Germany, seldom acknowledging its specific social and political significance, and leaving the majority of recent academic work on this area to occupation studies. which only covers the first 10 years of Britain's long patrol in Germany. German history writing has recognised how central these preparations for war in Central Europe were and how profoundly they shaped political and social life. But I think largely historians of modern Britain have yet to do so. And this relative obscurity is, of course, actually part of the story of the British in Germany. It gains a reputation for being a place where not much happened, where waiting and watching and training fell into predictable patterns. And Cold War soldiering has even been described by later generations of service personnel as merely getting drunk on the Rhine, or even not that close to the Rhine as well. But actually, the varied voices and experiences of a range of base residents, people who lived in these communities, tell us a much richer story of Britain's Cold War frontier, and tell it in surprising, moving, and everyday sorts of ways as well. And in my book, which is in its final manuscript stage, so hopefully out later this year or early next year, pending its a kind journey through the publication process, it aims to show how British people lived in these communities, adjusted from seeing themselves first as post-war occupiers in Germany to a frontline community in the Cold War, how they came increasingly to live in purpose-built British spaces, and how they readied themselves in various ways for a potential Cold War conflict, whilst at the same time working, raising families, travelling, having fun, growing up. They never lost sight of the UK, keen to maintain links with home and family, and reflected as well on the changes that they saw taking place back in Britain as well when they returned too. And the British in Germany continued a long-standing British cultural interest in German culture and character, and this was marked by admiration in these years, and looking back, many of the people we spoke to were very fond of German culture as well. British military communities in Germany, the book also argues, they brought with them specific international and domestic histories too to Germany, as well as much longer standing patterns for living overseas as well. Many people we spoke to, or a few people that we spoke to, said that particularly in Berlin, it evoked a sort of imperial lifestyle. Someone used the phrase, the British Raj in Berlin. So they bring with them all sorts of histories too. But the Cold War was at times obscured by other things as well, as British communities faced other pressing dangers, or dangers that felt more pressing, particularly the terrorist threat from the 1970s. And as conflict and international commitments took British forces elsewhere across the world, Germany became a staging post for other conflicts too, a vital hub in Britain's military world, and a key, if understated, element in people's views of a changing world and of Britain's changing role within it. All this underpins my more sort of simple call, I suppose, for a clearer recognition of British military communities in Britain's Cold War history. Not just to take this as a sort of accepted part of military history, but to understand its significance to social history and to political history as well. And I argue that the Cold War could be indistinct and its impact could be unevenly felt in these communities. Not everyone is living in a constant state of fear, but that it is entangled as well with other histories too, and it is important. And that these experiences of the many thousands of people who lived in Germany, British people who lived in Germany, give us a really unmatched case study for learning how British people understood the Cold War in the very place where they intended to fight it. And I would argue it does so more than any sort of spy drama or diplomatic drama. You know, for Britain, this is a major part of the Cold War. So I'd like to do two things in my talk today. First, I want to unpack some of the aspects of this fascinating social history of British military bases in Germany. And as I've said, Germany sometimes has an unfair reputation for being a boring part of Britain's military history. And I even have an academic article called Deterrence Can Be Boring, and the role of boredom in these places. But I want to counter that characterization today by showing you this is a very rich and interesting history, and to maybe explain where that reputation of Germany being boring or even sort of a peacetime place, where that actually came from. And second, I want to give you a flavour of some of the many interviews today that my research team and I have conducted. I will be reading them out for the benefit of the broadband of people tuning in online, but many of the people we spoke to were very evocative sort of narrators of this history as well. But we interviewed over 70 people, some of whom I know are tuning in online today, and we have them to thank for many of the insights that I will share today. We also analysed interviews that had been recorded previously by other researchers and documents held in national archives and museums, including this one. And you'll see some, many of you might have seen the exhibition that ran here about Germany, which was excellent, and the accompanying book. And then there's still lots on Germany on the upper floors here as well. However, our interview stage ended in 2020, which is quite a long time ago. And little did we know it, but that would mark the end of an era of what we might label now as the post-Cold War. By 2022, the outbreak of war in Europe shattered much of the certainty and even the nostalgia for the Cold War that we encountered in our interviews. And waiting, watchfulness, and wariness are once again the order of the day. So in the second part today, I want to, at the end of my talk, zoom in on the interviews that specifically talk about the end of the Cold War, because I think it is this long end of the Cold War that is so important to acknowledge, countering the idea that it all ended overnight in November 1989 when the Berlin Wall fell, and I think has contemporary relevance to us today. However, I'd like to start, though, by going back to November 2018 in a warm and welcoming living room in the East Midlands. I was there to conduct an interview with Bob Gill, a veteran in his late 80s, about his experiences as a young officer in BAOR between 1947 and 1948. And Bob Gill was also a Korean War veteran as well, which my previous work has looked at the Korean War. And having eaten my first mince pie of the season, which is something of an occupational hazard for oral historians, we began to talk about his upbringing in Manchester, his evacuation as a child during the Second World War, and his call-up as well, or as a young man, and then his call-up. He enjoyed himself and flourished, and came back safe and sound, as he put it. He described his sympathy for the Germans that he met, but he also talked about the largely artificial type of life that the British lived in those days, mostly separate from the German community. They socialised in the mess and went on leave to the Harz Mountains, all with other British and Allied service personnel, and from late 1946, their families as well. This all was against the background of rising tension with the Soviet Union, culminating in the Berlin blockade and airlift in 1948. Interestingly, though, when I asked about his military experience, Gill resisted the label of Cold War. He said, with experience of that type, how your mind works, you don't really remember. But it certainly wasn't such a Cold War. I mean, the very fact that it became a Cold War, that makes it sealed in a certain way. Gill felt that his experiences were far more on edge and far more unstable and maybe even dangerous than the term Cold War implied. It was serious stuff, he added. And this was one of the many ways Bob's interview drew me up short as an oral historian and a social historian of Britain's Cold War. Because my project, an Arts and Humanities Research Council-funded project, was predicated on the idea of Germany as a Cold War frontier. That's what it was called. And I wanted to understand what the Cold War meant to those who would have been on its front line should conflict, and potentially nuclear conflict, have broken out. But Gill's interview, and many others like it, forced me to reflect further on my approach, and to realise that the Cold War was always mixed up with many other overlapping social, political, and military histories, all of which needed to be unpacked. So in my book, when I explore the Cold War and life on its frontier, I try to be mindful of these complexities, and that the Cold War was not the only thing shaping military life or community dynamics in Germany. Nor is it easily understood as just one thing. The Cold War had many different meanings to different people. So we need to always examine the British experience in Germany as part of a wider international context, but also sort of British history, British domestic and social histories too. I also want to make the case for looking at this history in a much longer time period as well. And that first involves looking backwards. So, as Susan Carruthers argues, the history of post-war occupation long predates 1945, and they bring with them, all the occupying forces bring with them lots of history to their occupation. So when the British first occupied Germany in 1945, they do so still as an imperial power, with all the histories, ideas, and assumptions that come with that. And we need to understand these precedents, as historians like Christopher Knowles have done so well. We've also got to look forward as well. Most histories of the British in Germany do still tend to stop with the end of the formal occupation in 1955. There's a lot to cover between 1945 and 1955 as well, so there's good reason for that. And it is, after all, a decisive break, as the Federal Republic of Germany, West Germany, is established in 1955. But we need to look beyond that as well. And the recent exhibition that was held here at the National Army Museum and the accompanying book by Peter Johnston, formerly of this parish, was one of the first to really take seriously that period after 1955, to look at exercises like Crusader 80 and Lionheart 1984, to really understand the long history of the British in Germany. I would argue as well, we also need to look at the 1960s and 1970s, these perhaps more uneventful years of the long patrol. Because part of the meaning of Germany comes from its longevity, its apparent permanence. You know, this was going to be here to stay, and this was part of British military life. So we need to look at the long stretch to really appreciate that. And that runs up to the present day as well. It helps explain why paprika crisps and the very the fond memories of the yellow handbag of Hereford pills as well bring back so many fond memories for people, and why some people still feel such a strong connection with Germany today. So we need to look at that long history. But perhaps I'm getting ahead of myself, because why were the British in Germany in the first place? Following the defeat of Germany in 1945, the country was occupied in 4 zones led by the 4 lead victorious allies: the United States, Britain, France, and the Soviet Union. The British took over the immediate administration of the northwest region of the country, re-establishing local political and administrative bodies, overseeing the economic output in major cities like Hanover, Hamburg, and Düsseldorf, and assisting in the denazification, demilitarization, and other processes, often known as the sort of 4 Ds. But it became apparent, even by 1945, that British forces were not simply an occupying army. The Soviet Union was displaying increasing animosity to its wartime allies, culminating, as we know, in 1948, with the closure of routes to the capital Berlin in the Soviet zone, and the Allies mounting their famous Berlin airlift to supply its sector in West Berlin. By 1955, when the Federal Republic of Germany, West Germany, joined NATO, there were 77,000 British troops in Germany, and their numbers never fell below 50,000 throughout the Cold War, despite various defence reforms. So Germany is the definitive posting for generations of service personnel, a Cold War fact of life, as well as a central staging post for other deployments. By the 1960s and 1970s, though the Cold War continued, the British military's role in Germany settled into perhaps more predictable patterns of military exercises and routine activities. It was in this period, a lot of our interviewees felt that Germany starts to gain this reputation as being a boring posting, or a posting where no actual fighting took place. And for some, this was a problem. We spoke to one senior officer in Royal Signals who recalled a speech that he heard to an assembled parade in the 1970s. And the officer reputedly said, "Some of you will die riddled with bullets as the Russians come pouring over the border. Some of you will end your days choking on nerve agent, poison gas. Some of you might survive. Now, the problem with peacetime is there is nothing to make you terrified. I have provided that terror." And as I argue in the book, some people did feel the possible dangers of the Cold War very, very keenly. But others, at least certainly later on, were less worried. As one interviewee recalled, the beer was too good. So what was life like on these bases? During the 1940s, or what was life like for British military communities, I should say? During the 1940s and the initial occupation period, British families, many of them lived in requisition properties, most of which were in German towns or nearby. And British families had first arrived in 1946 under Operation Union, following pressure from military and diplomatic authorities already in Germany. Britain was the last of all the occupiers to allow families to arrive, and some diplomats pointed out that this not only hindered their professional work, but it looked to the Germans like the British expected war to break out. And despite misgivings expressed by Prime Minister Clement Attlee, Education Secretary Ellen Wilkinson, and even the architect of the post-war welfare state, William Beveridge, who interestingly conducted several lecture tours in post-war Germany, even despite their misgivings, British families were at last permitted to go to Germany. And by March 1947, almost 7,000 families had arrived in Germany. And by 1950, this amounted to 30,000 family members in the British zone. During the initial occupation years, British families could also not include anyone of German nationality in the initial period. Allied forces had banned fraternization in September 1944, banning acts of friendliness, familiarity, or intimacy, whether individually or in groups, in official or unofficial dealings. Under these regulations, marriage between British and German subjects was not permitted, but neither was visiting German homes, shaking hands, accepting gifts, or discussing the future of Germany. But these rules steadily relaxed, and the ban on British soldiers marrying German women was officially lifted in 1946, though they were still required to get permission from a commanding officer. In the month the ban was ended, it was reported that 82 British men and German women in Berlin alone were waiting to marry. And the British soldier press in Germany is very interested in this and makes quite light of some of these unions, describing them with the epithet, "until occupation do us part." But many unions could be long-lasting and common as well. Historian Paul Crystal even estimates that 10,000 British men married German women. But it's not until, interestingly, 1970 that the rule restricting soldiers with German-born wives from being posted to Berlin was lifted. And all of this begs a really big question, which is, did British people during this time form meaningful bonds with Germans during the occupation, but also in later Cold War years? It's a really big question, and I think it's probably not one I can unpack fully today, but it is one that is often frequently asked about these communities, and which Bettina Blum's work in particular explores in depth, and excellent work. For some, certainly, Germany was a place where they formed meaningful relationships with local people, cultures, and language. Some even opted to live in Germany after leaving military service. I spoke with one veteran, Peter West, who'd served in Germany, but had also been there as a boy, while his father had served with the British Army near Nuremberg in 1945. And this generational repetition, sons following fathers, was something quite common actually in our interviews as well. We interviewed someone who worked in an office that was just down the corridor from where his dad had previously worked as well. So this was not uncommon. But West, when we interviewed him, recalled his kind of boyhood revulsion at the local people he'd until recently regarded as the enemy. And he was very forthright in describing this. But he went on to say how his father had made friends with a local woodcarver who gave his mother a beautiful breadboard engraved with the Lord's Prayer that Christmas. And 50 years later, in 1995, West returned to the village with the breadboard and by chance met the village pastor. In his interview, he recalled the moment that they met, and I quote, "He looked at me and said, 'Das ist unmöglich, this is impossible.' And I said, 'Wieso? Why? How?' He said, 'I've been sat here for 3 days trying to write a sermon for next Sunday, which is Harvest Festival.' And he said, 'May I use this for the communion bread?' And as far as, and West finished with saying, 'and as far as I know, it's still there.' So this is just one of the many beautifully described by West sort of examples of meaningful connection that were formed between British and German people. However, it should also be said that in many of my interviews and in lots of archival sources, there is an almost universal acknowledgement that the majority of British people did not have quite such meaningful connections with local people. Bases were, quote, British islands set within a German mainland, with anglicised road names, jars of Marmite in the NAFI. Some people, especially those in Berlin, as I've mentioned, felt that it even echoed some of the days of the Imperial Raj, and that's the word they used, or they saw it as a separate, magical existence. So for some British people, British bases even represented the best of Britain, the traditional morals and a way of sort of living communally. But for others that we interviewed, it should be said, they felt that these bases were stuffy places where they felt outdated or unfair. But overall, though, people frequently reference how these places felt like Britain rather than Germany. And we must acknowledge that in our histories of these communities. Some of this isolation was perhaps due to changes in ways that people lived in Germany throughout this period. As I've mentioned, in the 1940s, people lived perhaps more closely with German local populations. Military children who grew up in Germany recalled how they played with German children, spoke German, and how their parents had engaged with the community in different ways. But by the 1950s and onwards, Allied forces had begun to build purpose-built base communities, complete with housing for families, welfare services, cinemas, even swimming pools. And lots of people felt that this was a significant change in how British people lived and engaged with the local German population. Why leave the base when everything was already laid on? Some people talked to us about how they felt that they bucked this trend. One former military child recalled how her mother, who spoke German well, made her practice asking for milk in the shop at age 5. Other women got jobs on the German net, such as one person we spoke to who worked in a meat factory. And she recalled how the work was awful, but, quote, it made me feel a new person, a person again, because I thought, I just don't want to sit in this flat all day. I want to be able to do something. And it should be said as well that different regiments, different units also had different relationships with localities too. Jeremy Hellier, military chaplain at 50 Missile Regiment, Royal Artillery in Menden, recalled how because of the unit's specific role, it was home to the Lance nuclear missile system, the regiment was in one place for a long time. He even recalled one sergeant major who retired after having served 22 years in the same place. And people in those kinds of communities married German women and perhaps were more integrated with the German community because the regiment was there for such a long time. But for others, there was much more movement, and where the bases were larger, perhaps as well, residents observed that there was less contact with local communities. One particularly mobile group that my research, that's very prominent in my research, are military children. And by 1945, British military children had, of course, they'd been navigating Britain's sort of global military world for centuries. But the post-war period witnesses a really significant turning point in their treatment, because they are all required to be educated under the terms of the new 1944 Education Act. And the presence of 4,000 children across 70 locations in Germany, all requiring education, as Sarah Patterson has observed, poses a massive challenge of an unprecedented scale. And the response to this is to set up the British Families Education Service. And it was established by the government to quote, translate the provisions of the Act into a military context. And some people even felt that BFES schools embodied the egalitarian spirit of the age. And one journalist asked, in how many schools in England will you find the son of a high-ranking civil servant sitting next to the son of Corporal Jones, who has on his other side the son of Lieutenant Colonel Brown? Now, how accurate some of these descriptions were beyond primary school is perhaps debatable, given that a lot of the time the children of officers were routinely educated in the UK. But some people did feel that these schools had a broad social reach. Many of the teachers that we spoke to felt like that. It's still a really significant moment in the history of education as well, in understanding the establishment of BFES. However, children could only make use of these schools while their fathers were in Germany, and with military postings usually lasting 2 or 3 years, children were still highly mobile. By the 1960s, and especially the 1970s, educationalists had come up with a term for this, turbulence. And children who grew up in Germany that we spoke to took different views on this term, turbulence. One former military child described how he would always arrive at a new school and be put at the bottom of the class before working his way up. Another described the inverse process of that. Others too noted that they seemed to study the Romans endlessly wherever they went. But others as well described Germany in really positive terms. They commonly described it as a time of freedom across the whole period. People remembered large gardens, places to play, wildlife. And one former military child felt that he could go anywhere in 1960s Berlin, even playing by the Berlin Wall, and he felt that children's parents largely left them to it, left them to do as they pleased. And many said how safe they felt. There were people on guard with guns, after all, one interviewee pointed out. There were, of course, as well, accidents and tragedies, and some people that we spoke to did describe significant sort of family tensions living in these communities. But on the whole, the people that we interviewed, at least, came away with a sort of positive assessment of childhoods lived in Germany. And the experiences of children and families are a crucial part of the social history of British military communities, but they do have a military significance as well. In one chapter in my book and elsewhere in an academic article, I've explored evacuation plans for families from Germany if war broke out. And even in the earliest plans, the treatment of families was seen as deeply important, not just in terms of guaranteeing their survival, but in terms of morale for those personnel who had to stay and fight. The secrecy around these plans changes during the Cold War. The early evacuation plans, including the first major plan, Operation Chivalrous, in the late 1940s, in those planning documents in the National Archives, military planners stressed the importance of keeping the plans secret, so as not to cause alarm amongst the British community, but also amongst German and European allies. But by the 1980s, the term non-combatant evacuation was becoming more common, and that had a greater emphasis on transparency and preparedness. Some residents that we spoke to remembered these plans and being informed about evacuation. Others had no recollection of it whatsoever. During exercises, some personnel recalled how they had to hand their car keys into HQ, presuming that it was so that their families could get out of BAOR if an invasion took place during the training. And interestingly, some particular details did stick in the mind of former residents with particular clarity. A number of people that we interviewed described how dogs would be potentially euthanized if war broke out. And one former resident described, and this is a quote, "When it happens, you'll report at this place and bring your dog so that the dogs can be euthanized. Then you'd get on the bus and you'd be driven to the Channel ports." And all the wives were nodding, saying, "Yeah, I'm in the car with the dog." And the fate of British pets shows the seriousness of possible war, but also how people might try and circumvent some of its harsher realities. These are just some of the many aspects of the social history of British bases that I chart in the book. But what I'd like to do with the remainder of my time is just to zoom in on one particular moment, and that's the end of the Cold War. How did British communities in Germany witness this amazing sort of historical moment and then deal with the long end of the Cold War? And what can oral history, actually, the methodology we use, tell us about this important moment as well? Asked to pinpoint the end of the Cold War, most British residents in Germany pointed to the fall of the Berlin Wall in November 1989. Many interviewees recalled the period with tremendous fondness. One teacher who'd lived in Berlin since 1978 with her family described how televisions were the first thing East Berliners bought. They gave them access to more information because they'd been starved of that. Yes, it was a very special time. Others described how ordinary life went on amid all this change. There was even a HMI inspection of Berlin BFES schools during that week. But one Berlin head teacher recalled that there was a hint of change in the air as well. She noted that in the British sector, immediately plans were put in place for how we were going to withdraw, and even about the legacy that the British would leave. And it was the start of a period of what one former soldier stationed in Hereford in the late 1980s called limbo, or what others have associated with the reforms of the early 90s, known as options for change. And as one of the largest groups of Cold War warriors, these narratives, these stories that people tell us have a great deal to tell us about how Britain understood its Cold War from the 1980s onwards and how maybe we think about the Cold War today as well. They look back strangely fondly on the Cold War and the certainties that it brought and its orthodoxies, however terrifying, though also not seeing it quite as a time of peace, as some commentators have argued. Most saw their departure from Germany as timely and appropriate, but still tinged with sadness, a sense that for them, as well as for what it meant for Britain more broadly. There were wistful assertions of a job well done and a victory for Western forces, echoed as well in some of the military histories that we see coming out at this time. And they draw a surprisingly quick line under such a long and policy-defining conflict, with the departure from Germany, again, just seen as a sort of natural moment of change. But actually, the sense of loss was really palpable throughout the 1990s and maybe beyond. Base residents in Germany saw themselves as living on borrowed time. And for some people that we spoke to, options for change was a short period of profound change and readjustment. But for others, there was a much longer period of kind of loss of purpose and even of sadness. One telecommunications operative posted back to the UK in 1991 said, "I'd have stayed. I was heartbroken the day I left. I cried, heaps." And others stressed their disappointment that a change was taking place and how places like Berlin felt. It wasn't quite sure what it was there for, and Germany was just a pool of people to be raided for other jobs. An anonymous writer in the Army Wives Journal said how the changes have driven right to the heart of military homes, with miserable families living with financial and other kinds of uncertainty. And one military wife recalled it was a last one out, turn out the light sort of thing. And that is what happened in 2019 to 2020, with just 2 barracks remaining in Paderborn, a vehicle storage depot in Mönchengladbach, and a munitions storage facility in Wulfen, which was once home to the Corporal nuclear missile system. So, to conclude, I hope I've given you today a flavour of the rich social history of British military bases and communities in Germany and their vital role in the history of Britain's Cold War, but also in British post-war social history as well. And there's a great deal more that could be said, and perhaps we can explore some of that in questions afterwards. But I'd end today by underlining that the British in Germany is a vital case study for our current time as well. After 1989, the Cold War becomes perhaps an object of nostalgia. It feels, as I hope I showed in the interviews, like a lost time, where the certainties of conflict, which had once structured so much military thought and countless working lives, had gone. But you don't need me to tell you that we are living in a time of change, when the Cold War is not necessarily seen as such a thing of the past. And the generations of military leaders who are currently contemplating the threat from Russia, they cut their teeth in BAOR. BAOR and Germany are really important for informing military thought, but also in thinking about military communities as well. And in November 2021, when visiting Estonia, then Foreign Secretary Liz Truss even recreated the famous image of Margaret Thatcher in that BAOR tank, showing an apparent preparedness for conflict with Russia. I should say, when I began this talk, she was Foreign Secretary, so it shows a lot of things. A lot of things have changed in the time since we started this project. Now, historians would urge caution when drawing parallels too readily between today's world and the Cold War. But what I would say is that case studies like this can help us understand long conflicts, what it was like to live with the possibility of conflict for all that time, and the ways that memories have formed since its ending. Thanks very much.